To bring it up to Korea, which we'll deal with much more briefly, Korean War began in June of 1950 when Kim Il-sung, the communist dictator of North Korea, ordered the South to be invaded. Did you ever wonder this, though? How did Kim Il-sung come to power in North Korea? Now, this guy was a communist, but Red China, which is right behind Korea, it didn't become communist until 1949. So what's he doing running a communist running North Korea in 1945? Well, once again, American diplomacy made it happen. In 1944, Foreign Affairs, the Journal of the Council on Foreign Relations, CFR, published an article called Korea in the Post-War World. And it suggested that Korea, which had been a colony of Japan, could be divided up after the war into a trusteeship to be occupied by the victorious allies, including Russia. And Harry Hopkins flew to Russia to meet with Stalin, and they worked out that deal. But what's the Soviet Union doing down in Asia? I mean, they weren't involved in the Pacific War at all. They had a non-aggression pact going with Japan during the war. But at the big three conferences of Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin, Roosevelt asked Stalin, would you be willing to break your non-aggression pact with the Japanese? And Stalin said, you know, I'll do that, but only on one condition. The United States has to supply me with all the weapons, vehicles, and material that my Far Eastern Army will need for that expedition. And Roosevelt agreed, and at U.S. taxpayer expense, 600 shiploads of Lend-Lease were sent to Stalin to equip his army to fight Japan. But you know, Stalin was a very clever dude. He waited until the war was almost over. His troops come down into China to fight the Japanese. But he didn't do this until 5 days before the war was over, officially. The atomic bomb had already pounded Japan. Japan was suing for surrender, but here come the Russian forces down, and then for 5 days participation in the war, he was rewarded by being made the trustee of North Korea. And he put Kim Il-sung in power, and he established a powerful army under Kim Il-sung, 150,000 men, hundreds of tanks, and you know those Russian tanks were really good back then, hundreds of warplanes, heavy artillery. But when the United States occupied South Korea in 1949, we left them nothing. No warplanes, no tanks. They didn't have one anti-tank gun. This was a total recipe for war. It was a setup. January the 1st, 1950, Kim Il-sung announced in a speech that this would be Korea's year of unification. He called for complete preparedness for war. What was the U.S. response to this? Well, there was a speech given at the American Press Club by the ever-intriguing Dean Acheson, our Secretary of State. You know, if you want to go deep state, it never gets deeper than Dean Acheson. All right, now, in this speech, he laid out America's defensive perimeter. It included Japan, but everybody noticed that South Korea was outside that defensive perimeter. And he said that if any country was attacked outside that perimeter, they would have to rely, quote, upon the commitments of the entire civilized world under the Charter of the United Nations. And that brings us up to the whole question of why did the oligarchs orchestrate the Korean War? You have to remember that out of World War I, you got the League of Nations, the first formal attempt at a world government. The United Nations came out of World War II, and that was entirely conceived at the Council on Foreign Relations. In fact, when the UN held its founding conference in San Francisco in 1945, 47 of the delegates were members of the CFR. Well, the Korean War was intended at that time to validate the UN as the world's peacekeeper. I'm going to quote the lead article from Foreign Affairs, April 1952, called Korea in Perspective, and here's what the author wrote. The burden of my argument then, based on the meaning of our experience in Korea as I see it, is that we have made historic progress toward the establishment of a viable system of collective security. That's the UN. And there was one other reason for the Korean War, and that was to strip Congress of its constitutional authority to declare war. And since World War II, we've never had a declaration of war. President Truman sent troops to Korea without so much as consulting the Congress. He said he didn't have to. Why? Because we were under UN mandate. We'd signed the UN treaty, and we were subject to its call to join in a war. In his press conference of July 29, 1950, he actually said, quote, "We are not at war," end quote. Therefore, Congress has nothing to do with it. It was a, quote, police action, end quote. That's all it is. It's not a war. Well, over 40,000 U.S. soldiers died in Korea, and over 100,000 were wounded. But not to worry, it's not a war, just a little old police action.